Liberated is a story-focused game that combines familiar gameplay with an excellent presentation. The bulk of the gameplay is focused on shooting. You have a small arsenal of weapons from a pistol, SMG, shotgun, and an assault rifle. The guns have a decent punch to them, and the added comic book effects improves their impact. Paired with the small arsenal are the small amount of enemies that you will fight. You will have your standard enemies, some with body armor, and a few different drones. The shooting controls mostly work unless you are fighting the drones. I didn't find the aiming to be as precise when you actually need to aim over your head. The shooting is really built for simple left and right encounters. Whenever enemies are not on your immediate right or left, the aiming can feel a bit wonky. What doesn't help this is that the accuracy of your guns is all over the place, with the guns not really acting that consistently. The difficult situations are when you need to contend with foot soldiers on your left and right, and then fighting floating enemies. This really shows the limitations of the controls and the shooting. What doesn't help the shooting is that the enemies you will be fighting can be really dumb, and you will roll through many of them. Stealth is also an option, but the game does not feel built for it. The stealth walk is really slow and ineffective to use. It is just better to just shoot all the enemies that you see. If you do opt to use stealth, you can hide in some areas and perform a takedown. There's some situations where you will need to run away from enemies, and these act as these brief set pieces to break up the action. And then the game will throw some QuickTime events into the mix to change things up. The use of the QuickTime events are inconsistent in their approach. There will be times where you are performing one action and you do 3 button presses to complete that action, and others will have you just doing 1 button press for an action. The 3 button presses feels odd to do for one action. If you were doing a sequence of actions, that would make more sense. But you will hit 3 button presses to jump out of the way of a car or to avoid the police in your car. Then there are sequences where the QuickTime events are used really well. The last area of gameplay are the hacking minigames. The same few are repeated throughout the game, and while I appreciated the effort in adding more variety, they really didn't do anything for me. Some were kind of frustrating in how they worked, and I will get into that a bit more when I discuss the flaws. Where the game excels is with its audio and visual presentation. The game makes you feel like you were playing a comic book. The cutscenes are done through these different comic panels, and the gameplay sequences will happen within those panels as well. The coolest feature of this is how the game transitions between gameplay and cutscenes. It's really impressive. I really have to hand it to the developers who worked on the cutscenes and developing this rich style. The panels are dripping with atmosphere and convey a lot about the world with each of the panels. Sadly, this is where my praise of the game ends. The presentation is excellent, but I wish that the gameplay and the story backed up that visual style. Let's start out with the story. The game is divided into 4 chapters. The first chapter is spent following this hacker. Through him, we get introduced to this dystopian world where people's freedoms are restricted for safety. Everything is monitored and controlled. You will eventually meet up with a local resistance domestic terrorist group called the Liberated, and you will work with them to essentially try to bring down the system. I had some issues within the first chapter, but I mainly disliked how abrupt the ending was. I felt like there were missing scenes that were cut out of the game. There is a character death that happens at the end of the chapter, and it did not emotionally land at all. It felt rushed and clunky in its execution. The second chapter sees us take control of a cop, and now we are on the other side of the law hunting the resistance group. The rest of the game has us switching between the resistance group and back to the law enforcement. We learn about secret agendas and events that had happened. The story is really familiar in its approach and very predictable. The second chapter also ends abruptly, and most of the rest of the game feels very underdeveloped. The world is interesting, and one I would like to explore more with the captivating visuals, but the writing is lacking in its ability to tell a compelling story. There are elements of a good story here, but most of that doesn't land because of the execution. The entire story felt like I was watching a Cliff Notes version of a good story. I felt like there were many areas where the plot points could be explored more rather than rushed along to get to the next story beat. I really like the idea of switching between the resistance group and the law enforcement. In theory, being able to see both sides of a conflict could help us understand the motivations of each side, and potentially put the player in the position of feeling conflicted on who to root for.
Hostile in the next room. Heading for the door. Behind you. Right, you'll have to go down the floor. Careful, Cap. There aren't many cameras on this floor, so stay alert. Incoming. They're wearing bulletproof vests. Ah! Oh, I'm hit. Cap.
I was surprised and impressed at first that the entire game was voice acted. With this being an indie project, it's not something that I would expect. But as the game continued, part of me wondered if the story would have worked better in its execution if there was not any voice acting in it. A lot of this was because the voice acting ranges from being okay to pretty bad. Plus, the voice acting can really shine a light on some of the bad dialogue. There were even instances where 3 characters in the same room had one character who had a different and lower sound quality than the rest of the characters. The performances had a sort of straight-to-video quality to them.
You already know his brother Tim, former special ops and the best driver we've got. James here is our mole in the police department and your guardian angel. He managed to buy you some time before you were ID'd.
You're lucky to be alive, kid. All hell broke loose when they found out who you really are.
I appreciate that the developers were trying to improve their presentation, but if you cannot get the appropriate talent to voice the lines, then it might work better to not have those lines voice acted. My main issue with the game is that outside of some of the small, interesting one-off parts and getting to use a new gun, the gameplay felt incredibly simple and flat. You will spend most of your time shooting enemies, but the AI is really dumb. They are not dynamic and will usually just stand still until you kill them. Many of the AI will ignore their partners getting shot right in front of them. The shooting controls could have been better so that the aiming didn't feel so clunky when you were fighting the drones. I did like how you could use different guns at different points in the game, but each of the firefights began to feel like the same firefight used over and over again. The gunfights needed more variety. I also understand that the game was going for a more cinematic approach with no HUD, but there were times where I wished I knew how many bullets I had left so I knew if I needed to reload. Also, there were times where I would fire my gun continually and never need to reload. This was confusing and I don't know if it was some type of bug. There is some platforming and this was yet another area that did not feel right to control. The jumping felt clunky and off. I had the perfect storm of a bad combat encounter with poor shooting controls and the platforming within Chapter 2. There is one part where you need to fight an enemy on your left and right along with dealing with a bunch of drones that come down from above. First you need to jump to the platform and this was always a bit wonky to do. Then you need to fight several enemies at once, and you can only take a few hits before you die, and your guns are not consistently accurate and the drones can hit pretty hard. So in many cases I would get killed by the drones, or if I did make it through the enemies, my jump didn't work and I would need to do the entire fight over again. This was not fun at all because I felt like I was fighting the controls the entire time. The QuickTime events are a bit of a mixed bag. Some are well used and others are not. I already covered that the 3 button presses felt off to do when 1 button press would be fine. But then there are these action sequences that take place in the comic panels and you need to do a QuickTime button press for them, but they just look really goofy. Another thing I didn't like was one puzzle that was introduced in Chapter 2. The puzzle required you to connect different circuits together, but it never gives you any indication if you are making progress with that puzzle. It only lets you know when you completed the entire thing. Sometimes having that progress indicator can help the player know they are on the right track for the puzzle, but the puzzle just features different layers of gray, white, and black. If parts of the puzzle glowed when you completed them, that would have been better. I did not enjoy doing these puzzles and they felt like a lot of padding. I felt like it was a missed opportunity to not have the different characters that you play as controlled differently. It would have been nice if different characters had different weapons, movement speeds, or relied on different things. If the stealth was better, I would have had one character focus on sneaking and another on gunfights. Something to bring something unique to the playable characters. The game had them all feel the same to control. The game also has some silly animations that made me laugh at times.
Oh my god! Oh my god! What's wrong with your face?
Before I end this section, I want to praise the other area of the presentation. The music is really good and it fits the atmosphere and the story of the game. I really enjoyed it. Here are a few tracks from the game. Overall, Liberated has excellent presentation with its wonderful visuals and comic book style to its solid soundtrack, but everything else feels mediocre with its flawed execution. The story sets up an interesting world, but the game feels underdeveloped with its characters. Many plot points are rushed along to the point that the story feels very much in a hurry to get to the next story beat. Interesting concepts are not elaborated on, and at points it feels like scenes are missing from the game with how abrupt certain sections end. I commend the team in voice acting their entire game, but the quality of the acting ranges from fine to poor. The voice acting also sheds a light on the weaker aspects of the dialogue. I do think for this game, no voice acting would have improved the overall project. The gameplay sections feel simple and stale. The shooting is fun at times, especially when you get to use a new weapon, but almost all the firefights feel like the same sequence repeated over and over again. The jumping is very clunky, and some of the puzzles were annoying to complete. Liberated was pretty ambitious with its approach, and the presentation should be celebrated, but I only wish that all the other areas were as good as the presentation. I think the studio has a lot of potential. If they take the excellent visuals from this game and apply it to a better and more developed story with improved gameplay, then we will have something really special on our hands. Liberated has many issues, and if you are interested, I would wait for this game to go on a deep sale, and then experience it, since the presentation is at least worth giving this one a try. But be prepared for a flawed execution in all other areas of the game. Thank you very much for watching.